I'd like to thank Andrew Clark and the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy and CCSU for having us here to speak today. My name is Sara Sullivan. I'm a senior program associate with the Vera Institute of Justice. We managed this project, and I'm joined by my colleague Steve Chanenson, who was one of the participants of the project and joined us on our trip to Europe. So as I was sitting there today thinking about how to start this presentation, I'm learning that you kind of need a good opener. And one thing you should know about me, I'm originally from Philadelphia. So one thing that we're probably known for is being direct and to the point would be an understatement. So normally I'm not good at openers, but when listening to Mike Thompson and a number of other people talking about Clark's Dairy, I learned that last night I kind of had my own Clark's Dairy experience. Andrew and myself and my colleague Ram, who's also from Vera, and a few other people had dinner at Bar last night in New Haven. And we had no idea where we were going. He first told us that's where we're going to dinner, and I looked it up online, and it says Bar Nightclub. And Ram and I are like, where is he taking us? So we show up to dinner last night, and Representative Walker comes. And she says that her assistant told her she was invited to dinner, and it was last minute. And she's like, oh, I'm probably not going to go, I'm not going to go, until she learned that dinner was at Bar. And then she was there last night. So that was my Clark's Dairy experience. Thank you, Andrew. At dinner last night, we were talking about a lot of the great criminal justice reforms that Connecticut has ventured into over the past 10 years, a lot of which was talked about today. But at the beginning of this conference, Andrew kind of opened up with opening the conversation about what more can be done. And that question, what more can be done, is what started the idea of the European American Prison Project. As Andrew said, over the past few years, over the past decade, states have done a better job at looking to each other in order to learn about different ideas for corrections practices. And the European American Prison Project provided an opportunity for us to explore how jurisdictions outside of the U.S. respond to similar problems that we face. So during this presentation, I'm going to give a brief background and overview of the project. Steve and I will both discuss some of the lessons learned from both the German and Dutch correction systems. And then Steve will talk about some practices that could be adopted in the U.S. based on what we learned. And we'll have some time at the end for questions. So the project was inspired by a trip the funder, Don Spector of the Prison Law Office, had previously taken to tour European prisons. He was struck by just how differently prisons are run there compared to the U.S. and really wanted to bring that experience to others in the U.S. correction system. The idea was not to learn about their system and kind of copy and paste it into the U.S. The goal was really to immerse ourselves into systems that in some way do things very different, but that also have many practices that could be applicable to U.S. state criminal justice systems. During this intense week-long trip, participants were exposed to a new approach to the use of incarceration and the goals of incarceration. And while they were there, they learned that these systems, who may on the surface seem very different, really have more similarities than we originally thought. So through exposure to those systems, we hope to open the internal dialogue on what we can learn from these practices as a way to inform the development of policy. So our three state partners on the trip were Colorado, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. For each state, there were about 7 to 10 participants from each state that joined us. In our work and many of your work, we know that for any change to take place, it takes more than just corrections officials. It takes more than just legislators. It takes a group approach. So the state teams were made up of corrections officials and legislators, but also judges, defense attorneys, district attorneys, sentencing commission members, county representatives. And this really helped have a dialogue not only while we were in Europe, but when we came back, the states were able to talk about what implications it could have for their own state systems. The two countries we visited were Germany and the Netherlands. There were a few reasons we picked those countries. These countries have significantly lower incarceration rates than the US, and we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. They have extensive use of non-custodial sanctions, and they're also not too different, like, for example, the Scandinavian model, where some participants, wouldn't even, see similarities between the US. So during our trip, in Germany, we went to Waldeck prison, which is a prison for long sentence prisoners, and you'll learn later how they define long sentence prisoners is a little different than how we do. And Nostritz prison, which is focused on young adults, which is what they refer to as age 18 to 25. In the Netherlands, we went to two facilities, one that focused specifically on mentally ill and drug-addicted offenders. So we're now going to start talking about the key observations of what we learned while we were in Europe. I'm going to focus on the use of incarceration and then pass it on to Steve to talk about corrections practices. So their use of incarceration. If you look at the chart above you, this gives you the incarceration rates of the two countries we visited versus the US. The numbers included in this are both for the pre-trial population and the post-sentence population that are currently incarcerated. In Germany, it's 83 per 100,000 residents. In the Netherlands, it's 87 per 100,000 residents. And some of you may be shocked by this number, some of you may not. In the US, it's 716 per 100,000 residents. So as you can see, the US uses incarceration at a much greater rate than both of these countries. So let's get in a little bit to some examples from Germany and the Netherlands on how they're able to meet these low incarceration rates. I do want to preface this by saying, while it is important to see some of this information to inform the presentation, I am a policy person and not a research person, so I will do my best to kind of muddle through these slides, but if you have follow-up questions, I'd be happy to refer you to the source of the information. Okay, so why are these countries able to accomplish such low incarceration rates? Well, both countries rely heavily on non-custodial sanctions and diversion. The percentage of offenders sentenced to prison is approximately 5% in Germany and 6% in the Netherlands. In most cases, even for relatively serious crimes such as burglary, aggravated assault, or other crimes that are considered felonies in the United States, prosecutors divert offenders away from prosecution, or judges sanction offenders with fines, suspended sentences, or community service. So if you look at this graph above, it shows a breakdown of the different types of sanctions and how often they are used in Germany. Below the bottom section represents the diversion by prosecutors. So as you can see, about approximately half of all cases are diverted. And that number has grown over the past 30 years. So I don't know how well you can see these numbers, but all the way to the left is the numbers in 1981. All the way to the right is through 2010. So that bottom section is the diversion by prosecutor. The slightly darker section right above that is the diversion by the judge. If you take those two into account, it's almost half of their sentences. The next section above that, the yellow section, are fines. In the US, fines are generally used as kind of an added penalty in combination with other sanctions. In Europe, fines serve as a standalone and often preferred sanction. Germany uses the day fine approach. So using this approach, fines are imposed in daily units, which represent 1 day incarcerated. The number of daily units is determined based on the degree of guilt, and the fine amount per day is based on the offender's ability to pay. This is to ensure that the fine has the same impact on offenders who have committed equally serious crimes, but live under very different economic circumstances. In 2008, day fines were used in approximately 80% of cases in the former West Germany and Berlin. The next two sections up top, the green section and the purple section, show the prison sentences, but the green section are actually suspended prison sentences. So even when a custodial sentence is given, a relatively large percentage of these sentences in both the Netherlands and Germany are suspended. Suspended sentences are similar to probation in the United States, although suspended sentences may not necessarily attach conditions or require active supervision as probation does in the US. And then the very top line, which shows about less than 5% of all sentences actually result in a prison stay. Now we'll talk about sentence lengths. So of that top 5% sliver of who winds up in prison, the amount of time that they spend in prison is very different than the US. So now for the offenders that do receive a prison sentence, if you look at the chart here, if you go to the fourth one over, which is the 1 year or less, approximately 91% of prison sentences are for 1 year or less. If you go 2 columns over, 98% of prison sentences are for 4 years or less. That means 1 to 2% of prison sentences are 4 years or more. In contrast to the US, the average length of stay in an American prison is approximately 3 years. So now that we talked about the use of incarceration, or I should say the limited use of incarceration, now we're going to talk about, once you do get into prison, what's the approach corrections takes to what they see their role is in the criminal justice system. So Mr. Ray earlier talked about a culture change. And the culture of the prisons is, I think, the overarching theme of what we learned while we were touring these prisons in Germany and the Netherlands and meeting with their correctional officials. And the culture comes from what their approach is to corrections. So according to Germany's Prison Act, the sole aim of incarceration is to enable prisoners to lead a life of social responsibility free of crime upon release. In contrast to the US, where rehabilitation is a focus, but its level of importance is typically below punishment, incapacitation, and deterrence. Typically, while some programming is available, it is very limited compared to the European systems. There was a quote that was mentioned here today, and it was also something that one of our participants from Georgia said on the first day of our trip. We're sitting in one of the prisons, we're meeting with the officials there, and she said, something dawned on me. If you treat people like humans, they will act like humans. And this statement kind of carries throughout every piece of what we saw of the way they run their prisons there. So Steve's now going to talk about kind of how this approach is carried out into practice, and then talk about what those implications could be for the US systems.
So one of the things you've heard, no doubt, over the years is a discussion of why is it that people go to prison? What are we trying to do with individuals when they are incarcerated? And you will hear some people say that you are sent to prison as punishment, not sent to prison for punishment. And that is very much an attitude that is pervasive throughout the institutions that we saw in Germany and the Netherlands. So they talk about normalization and reintegration. The idea, again, that the simple fact, not so simple, of taking away the inmate's liberty, that's already the punishment. There does not need to be additional punishment in terms of the conditions under which those people are living. So there is an approach to inmate autonomy that is different than any institution that I've been in the United States. Under most circumstances, guards will knock before entering a cell. The inmates have keys to their cell. Now, don't get me wrong, these will look like real prisons. They still have the big, heavy doors, and the staff have keys that can override whatever it is the inmates choose to do. Yet, there's a level of privacy, a level of dignity that you don't see as often in American institutions. Inmates typically will choose their own clothing. They possess a level and a quantity and a variety of personal items that, again, was unusual based on my experience in American institutions. They have a certain degree of autonomy in regulating their daily life. Many of the sections of the prison will have pods with communal kitchens. It's a very different approach. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about what is reasonable to think could or should be incorporated, but that gives you a bit of a sense of what the institutions are like. The approach to discipline, because it is, after all, a prison. Things don't always go as staff would want, but discipline is used sparingly. It's used sparingly, and the idea is much more often to provide positive incentives whenever possible, as opposed to negative incentives. I'll mention a word that those of us of a certain age in the room may find remarkable to put with prisons. That's the idea of a furlough, right? That didn't work well for Governor Dukakis, but furloughs are a standard part of the experience. The idea is if you behave appropriately, what are we trying to do? Sara showed the slide. The idea is to lead to the reintegration into society as a productive member of society. There was an inmate in one of the institutions we visited who was a professional boxer. Well, if he stayed incarcerated for a couple of years without practicing his trade, he would find it very difficult to go back to that trade. So he got a furlough to go and box, and then he came back. It's a different approach. Segregation is another very different approach. The use of segregation is strictly limited by statute and by practice. In Germany, it can't be more than 4 weeks in a year for any one particular offender, and in the Netherlands, it's 2 weeks. That's the outer limit. When you would talk with the staff at these prisons, the thought of putting someone in segregation for multiple weeks was shocking to them. That's not how they use that system. The Vera report, which is available online, and some copies are here with us today, details that in some of these institutions, they hadn't used segregation for more than a couple of days in the previous year for all inmates. Mental health treatment, again, reflecting the focus on rehabilitation and an individualized approach. This priority is reflected by the number of mental health staff at the institution. For 1,400 prisoners, there were 35 social workers and 28 psychologists. A remarkable amount of professional staff. And that does not even deal with the fact that most of the seriously mentally ill offenders are not in their traditional prisons. That's treated as a special population, and most of those folks are in special clinical facilities. They really do put their money where their mouth is in terms of focusing on reintegration into society, taking the long view, if you will. Adults, what we would think of as adults, can be treated in Germany as juveniles if the courts determine that their moral or psychological development is still ongoing, and perhaps they are behaving in a way that is more typically juvenile. We see some movement in that area in our own laws with respect to juvenile death penalty, juvenile life without parole, but this takes it to a very different level. And they take a much more harm reduction approach as opposed to a prohibitory approach to drug offenders. Their focus is on reentry. Inmates are paid, and a portion of their income is withheld to help facilitate reentry planning. Sentencing plans, reentry plans are a very big part of what the professional staff do in working with the inmates. Similarly, probation and parole officers work inside the institution, not just in an administrative capacity, but the actual supervising officer who is going to supervise me when I get released will come into the institution and begin to develop a relationship with the inmate to help facilitate a smooth transition. Staff culture. Staff culture, again, is another dramatic difference. The amount of training time is remarkable. The amount of training time is remarkable. 2-year training course, both theoretical and practical. Theoretical, focusing on communication skills, active listening, crisis intervention. This is taking this profession to a much higher level. Now, part of that, and we'll talk about implications in a minute, part of that is what they're able to do given their resources, given the small size of their prison population, but it is a different approach towards staff from top to bottom. And staff-inmate interaction is also very different. The idea is to forge a cooperative relationship with what goal? The appropriate integration of the inmate back into society. So what about implications here? The German and Dutch systems are organized around ideas of resocialization and rehabilitation. The United States, not so much. So what can we do? What can we see and what can we take of what we want? So there was a lot of skepticism amongst the various members of the different state delegations. All you have to do is look at the difference in the incarceration rate. And it's easy to say, this is a totally different situation. It'll be interesting to see somebody else's prison, and that'll be fine, but what can we really learn? I think the answer is we can learn a lot. But what we learn is that there are options. What we learn is that there are ideas that could inspire us. Now, yes, I'm the chair of the Pennsylvania Sentencing Commission, but I'm really just doing that as a dodge. I'm actually a law professor, and academics are wonderful people. We study things that everybody else does naturally, right? So we have to figure it out, and everybody else does it. Well, there's a very smart law professor at the University of Minnesota Law School by the name of Richard Fraze, who's one of the few people who has done work on comparative sentencing. And he talks about the idea of legal transplants. The thought that we are going to take the entire German system and drop it in the middle of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, ain't going to happen. But there are small things that we may be able to borrow, small things that may work in our system. But we have to remember that it needs to fit into our society, just as their system has to fit into their society. There are all kinds of differences between German and Dutch society and American society, issues of income inequality, issues of the way in which we think about incarceration and punishment. But there are some examples to think about. One, of course, is something that many jurisdictions are doing, which is reconsidering the use of things like mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, that take away individualized discretion. Can also think about expanding prosecutorial diversion programs. When the Pennsylvania team came back from Europe, we reconvened and expanded our group to include more stakeholders. And there have been a variety of programs that we've been working on in the months since we've returned. None of them were brand new coming out of our experience in Europe, but many of them were inspired by what we saw. The idea that, hey, if it can work there, maybe some variation on it can work with us. Is it likely that we're going to be diverting the very large number of cases from formal adjudication? No. Germany, by the way, has other options involved in those diversions. But maybe we can expand some of the diversion programs that we have, provide greater access to risk assessment for prosecutors, so they can have greater comfort when they look at a defendant and say, you know, this is someone for whom perhaps a program could work. Bail reform is a big part of that. The idea of doing early risk assessments such that perhaps someone can be released pending resolution, and if it's a drug-related problem, get them into a program while they're on pre-release, while they are on release before trial. Not exactly a drug court concept, but along the same general lines. The idea here, of course, is it has to be properly funded, and that's always a challenge. What about using fines? We have mixed emotions in the United States about our use of fines, but we're very nervous about the thought of someone buying their way out of a problem. Yet, fines remain an area that may be fruitful for further exploration. Pennsylvania has fine guidelines now, and for lower level offenses for individuals who do not have the ability to pay those fines, there's an established trade-off with community service. Mental health is an enormous issue. And one of the things that one of Pennsylvania's judicial participants is spearheading in our state is a review of our fairly old Mental Health Procedures Act. Find ways to use the civil mental health system instead of the criminal system where possible. Our system right now is fairly rigid, requiring the use of psychiatrists. Not always easy to get a hold of those folks when we want them. Perhaps the legislation could be changed to allow the use of psychologists. And the idea of perhaps importing from as far away as New York, the idea of something like Kendra's law, to try to use the civil law to deal with a population that may otherwise find themselves in prison. Corrections practices. Perhaps the most stunning aspect of the trip was walking into that first prison. I have been in and out of prison, in a good way, for more than 20 years. I have never been in an institution so quiet. Now, part of the reason it was so quiet is that it was small. By our standards, this was a tiny little institution. But it was quiet because of the environment in that institution. That has everything to do with the normalization and socialization ideas that I talked about, the staff training that I talked about. And that's what led the Georgia participant to say, you know, if you treat these people like humans, you treat them humanely, they'll behave humanely. So, what are some of the things that are happening in Pennsylvania? Our Secretary of Corrections, John Wetzel, and unfortunately for you, he couldn't be here, so you got the B team in me. Secretary Wetzel was one of the two gentlemen on our very first slide. He's been trying a variety of things. Again, nothing that they hadn't thought of before, but with inspiration from the European experience. He's opened 4 transitional housing units, 2 of them more closed, like traditional institutions, 2 of them more open, that are exclusively for inmates that are about a year or less from their parole eligibility date. We have discretionary parole for most cases. Put those individuals together and take hand-picked staff that are also focused and committed to facilitating a smooth re-entry for the inmates. Moves away the distractions. At least that's the hope. Absolutely, the Department of Corrections Research Unit is monitoring who goes through that program and then what happens 2 years, 3 years, 5 years out, whether it makes a difference in recidivism. But the idea is to focus on going home, to focus on what is necessary to make a successful transition back to the community, to the point of the Department of Corrections helping these individuals get state-issued IDs, an issue that is an enormous problem at this point for many other inmates upon release, and providing them with access to information in their county where they're going back as to various services and resources that they're going to need. We're not yet at the point in Pennsylvania where our correctional officers knock on the door of the cell and ask if they can come in, but anything's possible. Other corrections practices, considering mother-child units. It's really a remarkable thing. We walked into one of those units in Europe and everybody knew, in theory, what to expect. And the general discussion on the bus was, yeah, well, that sounds fine, but no, we wouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense. And almost to a person on the way out of that unit, we said, well, hey, maybe. How many people would this impact? It's a very inspiring experience. Expand the focus on reentry. Revamp staff training. That's something else that Secretary Wetzel is doing. He had already been in the process of hiring a new training director before he went to Europe, but the idea of trying to align staff skills with what do we ultimately want at the end of this process. Inmates who go back to society and don't come back into the institution. Public safety from the long haul perspective. The other gentleman on the front slide, sitting next to Secretary Wetzel, was the then director of the Colorado prison system, Tom Clements, who tragically was killed about 3 weeks after we came back from Europe. And I was always struck, not only by his enthusiasm for this venture, but also by the motto or mission statement of the Colorado Department of Corrections, a safer Colorado for today and tomorrow, trying to put front and center this focus on the long term. So what do we think of when we're talking about revamping staff training? Maybe correctional officers need more time training on things like communication skills, crisis intervention, and for your typical on-the-cell block correctional officer, maybe a little less time training on firearms, which one would hope they don't use as often as they do their communication skills, which they use every day. The idea is to promote this very positive interaction between staff and inmates. The idea here is to align training with the programmatic goals, to recognize that the environment counts, and to try and give the inmates the tools that they will need to be successful. Is this something new? No. Are there new twists? Absolutely. New inspiration? Without question. The idea of looking to another country and saying, maybe that piece is something that we can use. The thought that we can look elsewhere and realize that people do things very differently than we do, and the earth continues to spin on its axis, is, if nothing else, a positive part of this program. You can read all about it in the report that the Vera Institute published. It's at their website, vera.org. I think we have a few copies. And with that, we're happy to answer questions, or Sarah's happy to answer questions, and I'm happy just to stand here.
Before we go to questions, I just want to kind of end with two things. One is I want to recognize over to my left, Ram Subramanian, who managed the project on behalf of Vera and was the author of the report. So if you're interested in getting copies of the report, we only have a few, but feel free to look to Ram. He'd be happy to provide them.
He might even sign a copy. That's what I'm holding out for.
I also just want to share one recent experience I had. Steve mentioned Tom Clements, the former director of the Colorado Department of Corrections, and I was recently in Colorado at the International Corrections and Prisons Association conference. And after we presented on this project, a woman came up to me, and it was Tom's wife. And she had just come off of receiving an award on behalf of Tom at the conference, and she just said to me how inspired Tom was from his experience in Europe, and how while he's not there to carry on what he learned, he hopes us and those of us that did participate in the project do continue on in our efforts in his name. So I always think about him, and I always think about that whenever I'm speaking about this project. And I hope as a woman who just lost her husband to at the hands of someone on parole who still thinks that there's room for these kind of reforms in the U.S., I hope you keep that story with you as well.
The obvious question is, what in the world does it cost to run these prisons?
That's a great question, and I don't think that I have the answer to that at my fingertips.
One thing that we found interesting was that the cost per inmate, so they did spend a little bit less on their prisons than we do, but the cost per inmate was much greater because of all of these programs that they provide. So while it is a cost savings measure to reduce the use of incarceration, they did not, just because they use incarceration so minimally, that did not affect them seeing how much they need to still invest into the people that do wind up in prison to make sure that they come out a better person and more productive in society. So.
And I know we explored the issue of trying to get comparisons along the metrics of recidivism, and it is complicated given the different definitions of not only recidivism, but from when do you measure, given the different levels of intervention. That's one of the reasons Professor Fraze talks about how hard it is to do comparative work.
Would it be safe to say that the phrase soft on crime is literally a foreign expression in the countries that you visited, and that legislators and candidates for office are not hampered by that?
I certainly do not profess to be an expert on the political landscape of either country, but there is no question that it comes from a different social background. One of the things that we were, I think, in my mind, privileged to see was when we were in The Hague, they took us to an older section of, and I can't remember the name, the first prison in The Hague. Okay, Ron will remember. In any event, which was a prison that was taken over by the Germans during World War II. And just before liberation, the various inmates, and many of them were political inmates, were taken out and shot. And they maintained one of those cells just the way it was in the 1940s. And they normally only open it one day a year, and they were very kind and they opened it for us. There is a very different attitude toward incarceration in some of these countries, in part because of their shared history. So this goes back to what I said before, which is you can't take the German experience or the Dutch experience, influenced as it was by the Second World War in very different ways, and assume that it's going to make sense here in the United States. There are much shorter sentences. Many fewer people who get prosecuted go to prison. Absolutely. But I think that it doesn't change the concern that we've been hearing about all morning, and including the concept from Pew about what makes financial sense. And if we look at things over the long haul, the argument is that over the long haul, we're safer treating people humanely. And are we safer by our very, very long sentences? That's a debate and a discussion, and different states are going to handle it differently.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the daycare? That's something that we have tried and we've approached several times here in Connecticut. And I'd like to hear what their reasoning was on why it works and why it's important.
I'll start.
Sure.
So there's a few things. One is to note that this is not something that's necessarily new to the U.S. There are about 9 current prison nurseries operating in the United States. There's actually one in Illinois where I worked for the Department of Corrections there, so I'm familiar with the program. There are a few things we learned about when we were in Germany, some of the reasonings behind not only having a prison nursery, but also some of the rules around it. On the offender side, it's really to promote that relationship between mother and daughter, or mother and son. And I will tell you that the program in Illinois, it was the women coming out of the program. While it's a small program, there are never more than 8 children at a time. The recidivism rate was 0 for women coming out under that program. One thing that we learned when we were in Germany, we asked how long can the children stay? And I believe it was up to age 3. And we asked, well, why that age? Well, we talk about here all the time in the U.S. about using research to inform our practices. The reason it's age 3 in Germany is because the research shows that the psychological development of a child, their memory really starts kicking in as far as what they'll remember later on in life at age 3. So there won't be any negative necessarily impact on the child spending time in prison up into that age. So those are just some examples of how they use the prison nurseries. And as Steve said, it was interesting. I mean, everyone went in not really interested, and it was the one policy that every single state came out of that prison saying, all right, we need to find a way how to do that in our state.
So I don't have much to add. I mean, it really is a traditional nursery. It would look like the nursery in your house, and a little kitchenette type area. And I think it's also, again, these things all interrelate. There's a very compelling logic to this when you think about the comparatively, compared to us, short amount of time that the inmate will be in the institution. So it's both to have the development and bonding with the parent, but also this mother is going to be out with this child. And why wouldn't we want to try to make that integration as productive and solid as possible? I think that's also part of what the Germans were thinking. How does that translate to the United States, especially when you have inmates at times with very long sentences? That gets complicated, but it seemed from what we saw to be such a positive experience that there were folks on their email on the bus going back saying, how can we do this? We'll see what happens. We haven't opened one in Pennsylvania.
Did any studies follow up with the children of the mothers that were incarcerated?
Not that I'm aware.
Right, I
Doesn't
don't
mean
know.
it doesn't exist, just not that I'm aware.
Anybody else?
Thank you. It was a great presentation by the both of you guys. I just wanted to speak. I did it, was stationed in Germany for a couple of years, Stuttgart, Germany, and I was just reflecting on the culture overall of the, of the people who live there. They have a whole different type of, they treat one another as human beings overall, not just the individuals, who are dealing with incarceration. Like if you walk down the street, everyone says hello to everyone. You know what I mean? We don't do that here. So we don't do that. And like one of the things that we hope to do, even with breaking the cycle and trying to help those that are, returning home from incarceration is like, coming together as a community in unity and treating everyone should be treated as an equal. There should be no big I's or little U's in here just because you have a criminal record, puts you in a second-class state or whatever, and that's what's happening. How do we as individuals, and this probably is all off of what you just talked about, but really, how do we as individuals begin to incorporate some of those principles that we saw here in your presentation, just in general with one another, let alone with the individuals who are coming out of incarceration?
I don't have easy answers to that one.
Just give me something.
I think it starts with small steps, with recognizing that there is an essential commonality between all of us and trying to respect that, both in our laws and in our programs and in our daily lives. It's not easy, in part because there are societal, see, now I sound like a sociologist. There are things about our society that push us into a different direction. But I don't think that is inevitable or irreversible.
I'm just curious, what constitutes these systems?
I didn't hear you, sir, I'm sorry.
I said, I'm just curious, what constitutes these systems?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I think that, these systems, as with all government systems everywhere, reflect the society from which they come. So I think some of the goals and beliefs of these societies are reflected through their system, just like ours are, and just like we want to continually improve ours. I think they feel the same way.
I had a follow-up on that, just in terms of employment, because we had brought that up earlier. How are folks treated in an employment process? I don't know if you came across this with a background check and the like coming from the prisons or in the systems that you experience.
Didn't get as detailed into all of the collateral consequences that come with imprisonment, except to know that the collateral consequences that we put on ex-offenders or ex-prisoners in the U.S., they do not experience the same consequences in Germany and in the Netherlands. And it goes back to Steve's point of your sentence to prison as the punishment. That the prison time being taken away from society, away from your family, away from your community, away from your job, is in and of itself the punishment. And they don't, to the extent that we do, continue to punish people through collateral consequences once released.
I'm curious about the level of diversity that one finds in German or Dutch prisons, given the disproportionate minority impact in our country around people who are in prison. I feel almost as if systemic racism in the United States is kind of the elephant in the room.
Do you have numbers? I don't have numbers at my fingertips, but it was, well, in the Netherlands, there was a noticeable immigrant population. In Germany, it was overwhelmingly Caucasian inmates. And I think those societies are going through their own changes, with EU issues and people moving across borders in ways that you wouldn't have seen a generation or two ago. So what little I know, and it really is very little about this, is they do have some statistical overrepresentation, but it's again, it comes from a very different baseline. So you walk into that first prison in Germany, and it was overwhelmingly white faces.
And part of that, just to give some context, so the state that we went to in Germany, Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, is a very rural state in Germany. It's like the northeast corner of Germany. So if you go to Berlin or some of the other more urban areas, it might have not been as white as what we saw. It's similar makeup to the very rural areas in the U.S. So that's, I think, another added reason why there was lack of diversity in the prisons in the German state that we visited versus the Netherlands, where, to Steve's point, was much more of a noticeable difference of the presence of not only non-whites, but people from other countries, migrants who were in their prisons.
Anybody else? Go back of the room and then over.
Since the biggest sanction were fines, was there any enforcement mechanism behind the fines in order for offenders to pay them?
Again, it's not something I'm particularly familiar with, but yes, my recollection was as in this country, if it's a willful failure, it could ultimately result in incarceration. But My understanding is that didn't happen very often. And part of that was the fines were structured in a way that they were payable by these individuals and trying to use a day fine type system, certainly in Germany.
Were there drug sentencing policies the same as ours?
No. It is much more treatment-based. The phrase they like to use is harm reduction. It is certainly possible to be incarcerated for drug trafficking, but if addiction is involved, that really becomes the focus. The focus becomes, from their perspective, on the future and what can be done to break that addiction with the goal of law-abiding behavior from this individual in the future.
Okay, we have time for one.
Just a question. Do people there kill each other? I mean, do
In
they rape
prison or in the society?
I'm saying in society, as far as sentencing, if 98% are doing less than 4 years, how do they sentence aggravated assault, rape, things like that? Or does it exist?
It does. I think the rate of those kinds of offenses is not as high
I mean,
as what we have.
when we were in the Netherlands, we sat down with 3 gentlemen who were in one of their treatment communities, and all 3 were in there for some varying levels of murder or manslaughter. And I think the maximum term that one of them was serving maybe was 15 years. I know one was in for 7. So yes, they have murder, and yes, they treat, their response to it is with incarceration, just not to the degree that we use it for. It was really interesting. We had the opportunity to talk to some offenders, and the 2 questions every offender, whether it was in Germany or the Netherlands, no matter what facility we went to, they asked was, based on their circumstances, how much time would they have gotten in the U.S.? And there were one gentleman who was sentenced, I believe, to 7 years in Germany. There was a Colorado judge that was there. So she asked him some questions, what his criminal history was, some other questions. And I think it was somewhere up to like 25 to 30 years that he would have gotten if in Colorado. And then the second question was always about capital punishment. Just a concept that they couldn't wrap their heads around enforcing capital punishment. Obviously, neither of those countries have it. So,
Of offenders, the Dutch in particular, have sentences that would look familiar to us. So they do have some of that, but that's not what they do with the overwhelming majority. And again, there are differences there that are at times so broad that makes no sense to think that we're going to end up where they are. It's not what works for us. But there are other aspects, some of those smaller legal transplants, that I think are worth considering.
Okay, thank you very much.